Okay, welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be learning about gender and political participation. And in this lecture, we're going to learn about the gender gap in voting, public opinion, and party identification. Okay, so what are we going to be looking at and learning about in this lecture? Well, we're going to be talking about the gender gap. That is the difference between men and women as it relates to voter turnout, public opinion, and party identification. So let's get started. So what is voter turnout? Well, voter turnout is the number of people who vote divided by the number of people who are eligible to vote. So for example, let's say you lived in a really small town and there were 100 eligible voters, and of those 100 eligible voters, 10 came out to vote. That would be a pretty low voter turnout rate of 10% voter turnout rate. In other words, 1 out of every 10 voters voted in an election. So what is voter turnout in the United States? Well, it depends on what election that you're looking at. Different elections, different level of voter turnout. The highest level of voter turnout that we have is during, not surprisingly, presidential elections. Gets a lot of media coverage and a lot of people get involved in participating in the presidential election. But when it comes to local elections and state elections, you get much lower voter turnout. In the 2020 presidential election, but from a little less than a year ago, and this is based on U.S. Census data, 155 million people voted, and that was resulted in a really high voter turnout of 66.8%. And so nearly 7 out of every 10 eligible voters voted. And it was one of the highest turnouts that we've had in a presidential election in decades. And here is a graph from the Pew Research Center that basically shows voter turnout in presidential elections over time from 1980 to 2020. And you'll see that, we've seen an increase over time in terms of voter turnout. And so in the 80s and the 90s, you sort of had mid-range 50%, but starting in 2012 and 2016, we've seen a pretty significant, almost a 10-point increase in voter turnout. Okay, so what about the gender gap in voter turnout? In other words, the difference between the turnout rate of men and women. If I were to ask you, who do you think is more likely to turn out to vote in a presidential election? Like, who do you think is more likely to vote in a presidential election? Do you think men are more likely to vote in a presidential election or women? Well, women have a higher voter turnout rate in the United States. It's not a lot, but there are more men than women in the United States. So you actually see that a higher level of voter turnout results in more women coming to the polls to vote. And here is another graph from the Pew Research Center that basically shows you the gap in gender voting over time. Up until the 1980s, until the election in 1980, there was no gap in voter turnout, that men and women voted at about the same rate. And prior to that, men were more likely to vote than women. But starting in 1980, that we've seen a gap between turnout between men and women vote at a higher rate than men. And so you can see that the gap has widened, in the 1990s and, still stays about a 4% difference. And there's the turnout difference between men and women for the most recent election in 2020. So let's look at the specific numbers for the most recent election, which is the presidential election in 2020. And this data is from the United States Census Bureau. So 155 million people voted in the 2020 election. That's about 66.8% voter turnout, really good rate. 72 million men voted and 82 million women voted. And so the difference between the turnout rate was 65% of eligible men voted and 68.4% of eligible women voted, a 3.4 difference. So not large, however, significant. Women made up 53% of the 2020 voters in the 2020 election. In other words, 20 million more women voted than men did. It's nearly the same as 2016, a 4 percentage point difference, so about the same, but less people voted in the 2016 election. So why are women more likely to vote than men? Well, there's no consensus on the cause from a social science perspective, but there are a few plausible theories. So, for one, women are more likely to be poor. Uh, uh, when you look at all the people living in poverty in the United States, 56% of those living in poverty are women. So their chances of being in poverty are higher than men. Women are also more likely to be the primary caregiver in their family. Two-thirds of primary caregivers, that's both for children and for elder care, are women. And so the thinking is that because women are more likely to be poor and because more women are likely to be the primary caregiver, they're more attuned to and perhaps dependent upon social safety net services. Okay, and so if you're poor, you're going to be more likely to receive food stamps. More likely to receive, rental or housing subsidies. More likely to be on temporary aid for needy families. And if you're a primary caregiver, you might be sort of very attuned to the fact that we do not have paid leave to take care of, at least not as a national policy, to take care of children or the elderly. So since women are more likely to either be dependent on social safety net policies, or be aware that those social net policies do not exist, that exposure to government policy or the absence of policy makes political outcomes more important for women, right? So they might be thinking, hey, I can't sit this election out. I need to have my voice heard because I want certain kinds of policies, particularly social safety net policies, to be enacted. And so if you're not as influenced by government policy, you might feel, or aware of government policy influencing your life, you might be more willing to say, the vote doesn't really matter. But if you're more impacted, you're probably more motivated to participate in the political process and less likely to just sit an election out. All right, let's move on to our next gender gap, and we're going to take a look at the gender gap in public opinion. So public opinion is defined as, and this is from my American government textbook, as the attitudes that people have about policies, events, elected officials, and politics. And so, like, if I were to ask you, do you support having 12 weeks of paid family leave, and you had an attitude about that, yes, I support it, or no, I don't support it. If I were to ask you, do you approve of the job that President Biden is doing, and you said, yes, you do, or no, you don't, that's an example of public opinion. Now, women and men hold different opinions, public opinions, on several key issues. Not on all, there's not always a gender gap, but we're going to take a look at some of the key issues where we see gaps in public opinion between men and women. And then we're going to look at some theories that help us understand why those gaps might exist. And so when it comes to things like gun control, reproductive rights, and social welfare programs, we see some pretty significant gaps. So let's take a look at some of the survey data that that demonstrates or illustrates these gaps, these gender gaps in public opinion. So this information comes from the American National Election Studies, the ANES, and it is a survey that is taken of American voters every presidential year. So the last one was in 2016. This one's from 2020. And it's a very large survey. It's been around for a really long period of time, since 1948. It's hosted at the University of Michigan, so it's probably one of the preeminent sort of sources for getting a sense of the opinion of the American electorate. All right, so, here on the side are the questions that were asked in the survey. And then you have women, men, and then the gender gap. Let me put on my magic pen here. That doesn't mess anything up. So this question is asked the federal government should make it more difficult to buy a gun. Okay. So asking people, should the federal government make it more difficult to buy a gun? And then these are the people who said yes, that the federal government should make it more difficult to buy a gun. So 55.6% of women said yes, it should be more difficult. Men 43. You see that gender gap there of 12 points. That's a pretty significant public opinion difference. Favor requiring employers to offer paid leave to parents of new children. 73.9 for women, 66.4, 0.5. But you will note that the majority of both men and women support requiring employers to pay for parental leave. Of favoring allowing transgender people to serve in the armed forces, 48% of women said yes, they favor that. 40% of men say they favor that. Again, a gender gap. And also that you don't have a majority in either of those, okay? Gay and lesbian couples should be allowed to legally marry. Again, very strong support from the American electorate, but more women are likely to say, yes, it should be legal than men, but still a lot of support for that. And then federal spending on aid to the poor should be increased. Here, a majority of women say yes, 53.8. Less than a majority of men say yes, 48% say that it should be increased, spending for the poor. So again, a sort of a significant gender gap there. This table shows you, this graph shows you, it's from the Pew Research Center. And it's asking questions about whether or not you would rather have bigger government and more services, or do you want smaller government and fewer services? And so the black line is, hey, yeah, I want bigger government, and the yellow line is want smaller government. And on this side are women, and this side men. And you can see a really big difference. It's almost like a polar opposite, right? That at least here, as we in 2019, we see that there's a real growing gap, right? In terms of women are much more likely to support a bigger government. And, men are much more likely to say that they want smaller government and fewer services, okay? So this is just another way of just almost seeing the polar opposite in terms of attitudes regarding government. You'll also see that with women, that they, it was kind of 50-50 from 2009 moving forward. But, in 2017, see that opinions of women sort of changed, whereas opinions of men have remained somewhat flat. I'm not sure why that is, but it's interesting to notice. So what about reproductive rights and public opinion on the issue of abortion? Do we see a gender gap there? Well, at one level, we don't really see a gender gap, right? This graph, again, from the Pew Research Foundation, this is showing views on abortion in 2019 by gender. And it says there that men and women express similar views on abortion, that 60% of women, and so let me put my magic pen on there, 60% of women and 61% of men say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, right? And so when you look at it this way, there's really not a gender gap. And that the percentage of those who say that it should be illegal in all circumstances between men and women is pretty similar. So when you look at it in that you ask a question in this way, you don't see a big difference in terms of public opinion on abortion rights. But let's take a look at the ANES, and see that when you dig into the data a little bit more, you do find somewhat of a gender gap on reproductive issues. And so here's the data from the American National Election Studies. At the top here, that you see that when asked the question that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances, that 19.7% of women say yes, it should be illegal in all circumstances, 19% men, which corresponds with what we heard on the previous slide. Very little, if any, significant gender gap. But, you do see sort of a gender gap here on this question. And so you remember on the previous slide, they asked a question about whether or not abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances. But when you ask the question, should a woman be able to obtain an abortion as a matter of choice, right? That it is, really that it's up to the woman to make that decision, the woman and her doctor. And here you do see a growing gender gap. 55.4% of women say, yep, that it's a matter of choice. and less with men. And so it could very well be that there is a little bit of a gender gap when that abortion should always be legal. Maybe men are a little bit less likely to support that. Not a huge gender gap, right? But just something to keep in mind. Here is the question: is should employers should not be allowed to decline coverage of abortion in insurance plans, right? And so this is basically saying, nope, employers have to, if you offer an insurance plan, you've got to cover abortion. And 55% of 0.7% of women say, yep, insurance plans from employers should cover abortion. 47.2% of men say that it should. Again, kind of a gap, just informational, right? I mean, I'm not sure what we want to conclude from that, but that when it comes to mandating that employers cover abortion costs, more support from women than men. I thought this was interesting, that the question was, would you be upset if the Supreme Court reduced abortion rights? And 51.4% of women said, yes, they would be upset. But 42.8% of men said, nah, not so much, wouldn't be upset, right? And so, a gender gap there. And so that's sort of interesting in terms of mobilizing voters. Women might be more concerned about the Supreme Court and who sits on the Supreme Court, at least as it relates to abortion rights. Okay, so why is there a gender gap in public opinion? Well, just as we saw with trying to explain the voter gap, the gender gap in voter turnout, there are many theories that have been put forth to help us understand why there is a gender gap in public opinion. Dr. Mary Kate Lizzett from Augusta University has done a lot of work on this, so if you're interested in learning more, you might want to look at her work. And also the Center for American Women in Politics has also spent a lot of time sort of analyzing gaps in public opinion. Just here are some of the theories that those two entities have come up with. One is gender socialization. So, it's well known that boys and girls, men and women are socialized differently. And that young girls, women are socialized to be more caring, more cooperative. Men are, more socialized to be assertive, more independent and autonomous, right? And that, that gender socialization can play itself out in a multitude of opinions and support for public policy. That if women are socialized to be more caring, then they might be more supportive of spending to help the poor. If men are more assertive or more autonomous, they might say, hey, you don't want government interfering, let people make their own decisions, right? So it could be a product of gender socialization. It could be an awareness of gender-based inequalities, whether or not women might experience gender-based inequalities because of their lived experience. Also, women are more likely to be feminists than men, and feminism is about highlighting and educating people about gender-based inequalities. That when it comes to supporting policies that reduce gender inequality, or maybe other inequalities as well, it's likely that women are more supportive of those policies and support addressing gender inequalities just because they're more aware of it. And then finally, that there is a theory that women express different values than men, and that could be a product of gender socialization or awareness of gender inequalities. And so women are more likely to endorse or hold values that are known as sort of pro-social values. And so that, in other words, that they value helping society as a whole. And so that could help us explain why women are more supportive of social welfare spending, why they might be more supportive of gun control because they see guns as damaging society as a broad. They're potentially less supportive of the death penalty because they might see that as being sort of antisocial, killing people, having the state put people to death, whatever. But that's another theory for to help us understand those differences in public opinion. Now, I want you to keep in mind that women are not a monolithic group and men aren't a monolithic group either. And so race, ethnicity, party affiliation all impact public opinion. So the public opinion, we're just looking at men compared to women, but public opinion within women, like within different race, when you take race into consideration, the difference between white women and black women, or Latino women and African American women, also the difference between women who affiliate with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you're going to see real differences in public opinion. And also there's differences in opinion among men and women. And so that, that men who affiliate with the Democratic Party are more likely to be aligned with the public opinion of women who affiliate with the Democratic Party. So just keep in mind when it comes to public opinion, there's a lot of other factors to take into consideration beyond just gender. Now, this brings us to the last thing we're going to be talking about in this lecture, which is the gender gap in party identification. Now, prior to 1980, there was no difference in the way men and women voted in terms of party affiliation. That just as many women were Republicans as men, and just as many men were Democrats as women. And so that men and women were equally split between the parties. That all changes in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, that a women's voting bloc manifests itself, and it's a voting bloc that remains in place today. And that voting bloc is basically that women are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Why? Why 1980? What happens in the 1980s? Well, starting in the 1980s, we see that the GOP, that is the Republican Party, the grand old party, the Republican Party, pivots right on a host of issues, but specifically on women's issues. And it's seen as starting this culture war that leads to women leaving the Republican Party. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So starting in the 1980s, and actually a little even before that in the 1970s, we see the rise of the conservative religious right. And often theorists think that this is due to a backlash to the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. And so, the 1960s and 70s, it was a movement for racial equality, but it was also a movement for gender equality, and a movement for gay rights as well. And so when some folks saw the rise of the feminist movement and saying that, when women should be out of the house working, that they don't necessarily need to be the primary caretaker of kids. We see this rise of saying that, homosexuals, gay, lesbian folks are no different than straight folks and they deserve rights too. And that freaked out some people in the United States, and they wanted to return to more traditional values. And so, this return to these more traditional values really fed into the interests and values of the evangelical Christians in the United States. And really, for the most part, until the 1980s, evangelical Christians, stayed outside of politics. They were like, let's just have our eyes on getting into heaven. Don't get involved in the dirty world of politics. But there was a sense that if evangelical Christians didn't get involved in politics, then these liberal politics of feminism and gay rights, etc., would sort of take over our policies. So they felt like they could no longer sit on the sidelines. They needed to get involved more actively in politics in order to return the United States to these traditional values. So traditional values such as men are the head of households and women should play their natural role as caretaker and tender of the house. Roe v. Wade, the right to have an abortion, 1972. There's a big movement starting in the 1970s and 80s to say that abortion is a sin, it's immoral, it's wrong, and should be illegal. Also, that homosexuality is a sin, it's against the Bible, etc. And so, that was present in the United States, but what really made the conservative religious right powerful in the United States is because it aligned with the political party. And the political party it aligned with was the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party aligns itself with the religious right, in part because they sort of share values, but not exactly, because a lot of the Republican Party was not traditional family values prior to the 1980s. But they did it in large part because they saw it as being electorally successful. That if you align yourself with the evangelical Christians, you've got this Christian voting bloc that's coming out to the ballot box, your party aligns with that, you're more likely to win elections. And that led to women leaving the Republican Party and joining the Democratic Party. And here are some pictures of people that are famous for being aligned with the rise of the conservative religious right in the 1980s. Up here, what we know about Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly is the conservative who led the movement against the passage of the ERA, and quite successfully. You might have heard of Jerry Falwell. He was the founder of the Moral Majority, and that was a political action group that was committed to furthering a conservative religious agenda. You might not have heard of Anita Bryan, because you guys are a lot younger than I am. She was from Florida and known as like the orange juice lady, but she was also involved in anti-gay rights activism. And so in the 1970s, there were a lot of anti-discrimination laws that were prohibiting discrimination against gay and lesbian folks in the United States. And she led the movement to get rid of those to challenge those anti-discrimination laws. And there's President Ronald Reagan. It was at this point where the GOP really aligns itself with the Christian right. So these are just some of the cast of characters that you might be familiar with in terms of the rise of the religious right and the change of the Republican Party. Here is a graph that shows from the Pew Research Center that shows you this gender gap in party identification. On the top here, you see that men, and so that 50% of men are more likely to identify with the Republican Party than so 50% identify with the Republican Party, 42% identify with the Democratic Party. And you see the flip here, that 56% of women identify with the Democratic Party and only 38% identify with the Republican Party. So what are the implications for the gender gap in party identification? Well, I want to refresh our memories on when we sit about what a voting bloc is, right? A voting bloc is a group of voters that are motivated by common concerns. And so if you see women who are voting, for a particular party based on particular values, right? Not all women, but more women, and they kind of constitute a voting bloc, right? Because they're motivated by certain concerns. And so if you're able to capture that voting bloc, there, as a political party, there's a potential for more political power. Plus, women are more likely to vote, right? And so if more women are likely to vote and they're more likely to vote for the Democratic Party, it's very possible that candidates and parties may see a voting bloc as key to their electoral success. So woo the bloc. So more women vote, more women are Democrats, women are key to the Democratic Party victory. That's oftentimes the way the Democratic Party thinks. Get the women's vote, and then you're going to be more likely to win elections. But the Republican Party is also starting to think, hey, can you really keep winning elections, particularly national elections, without women, without wooing the women's voting bloc? So it's very possible that the Republican Party might need to shift in terms of trying to bring more women back to the Republican Party if they want to remain electorally successful. Okay, that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the gender gap in representation, and with a specific focus on representation in the United States Congress. Thanks for listening. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you again soon.